seen that book before. It's a good reminder for all of us. I'm going to switch mics for a second here. You're all going to watch me make a mess of it. There we go. You deserve a vacation. Is this on? Yes. You deserve, I want to make sure you heard that. You deserve a vacation. You've earned a break. Have you ever heard yourself say those words? Maybe you said them to Pastor Sarah last week as she prepared to be absent for a week. Do you know all the work that clergy do when they're going to be away? She did more work on this service than I did, and she's not even here. Go on, Pastor, you've earned it. Maybe you said this to yourself, or noticed that you've gone on way too long without actually taking a break. Maybe sometime you've come to the brink of the weekend and thought so much was yet undone that you couldn't actually bring yourself to pause and just be. I can't take my day off. I haven't earned it yet. I confess that sometimes when I take a real, restful, joyful day off, like Jesus did in the story we just heard, around 5 p.m., I'm almost gripped with this feeling of vertigo. Even though I know my work, my very ability to be present with others is enhanced 1,000 times over by the pleasure of a Sabbath rest. Those messages are still cranking away deep in my mind, the inner critic complaining, how could you have wasted an entire day? I know it's a huge generalization, but unless I'm the only one in this room who's had those thoughts, I think it's safe to say we have some unhealthy relationships to work and rest in the United States. I've certainly lived many chapters of my life running that race toward an imaginary finish line of accomplishments, seldom stopping to get off that treadmill and restore my soul. It is fitting to pause and think about this on Labor Day weekend, isn't it? To remember the origins of this holiday in the U.S. It began during the Industrial Revolution, when rapidly growing industries squeezed more profit from workers by diminishing their working conditions, their pay, increasing their hours. The labor movement is to thank for protections like minimum wage, child labor laws, and of course, the weekend. I'm from Oregon, and I learned a fun fact this week that my home state was the first to observe a Labor Day, and it was in like the 1880s, something like that. It's been around a while, and yet we still need the focus on labor and rest. We need the reminder no less today in a dominant culture that equates worth so closely with productivity and wealth. There's no relief from these attitudes creeping in. No matter how financially comfortable or secure we might become, or if the work that many of us do now might be less physically demanding. We turn down invitations from friends, even ghosting at the last minute, because we're so busy. We feel more important when we're double booked. We sign our kids up for more activities than they can handle during the school year. We forget about keeping a holy day for being rather than doing. Brene Brown says, it takes courage to say yes to rest and play in a culture where exhaustion is seen as a status symbol. I've been thinking about that a lot since I heard it a couple weeks ago. And this is nothing new. Human beings seem prone to forgetting our, humanness and our built-in need for rest. Isn't it striking that God's commandment to Moses and the Israelites Israelites to take a break is so direct and harsh. Sounds a lot nicer in the Jesus Day Off book, but there's no choice about it in the Ten Commandments. You take that day. Period. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. There is nothing in here about earning it. Nothing about waiting till you feel done with all the important things you have to achieve. The millennia-old practice of Sabbath interrupts these patterns, recalibrates our sense of who and whose we are, and our illusion of control. I trust there's a personal message in here for many of us in these words today, and we would do well to take it. But you know, God's got more to say to us today. The you God speaks to in the commandments refers to each faithful individual specifically. These are all things that they're supposed to do, individuals, families, communities. But that you is also being spoken to a whole people on the verge of deciding how they will live into the future. And when it comes to the commandment to keep the Sabbath holy, our nation is at a major decision point. Now, this is not the sermon on the Ten Commandments that's likely being preached in a lot of churches lately, and on the stump as candidates vie for our votes. This isn't a sermon that's being preached by Christian nationalists insisting on a narrowly interpreted version of religion being imposed in public schools. That is real, it is really happening. The irony to me is that the wisdom of God's commandments handed down through Moses is they're actually intended and designed to protect the most vulnerable of any group from being left out by those who have more power. You shall not do any work, you, nor your children, or workers, or even animals. In the days of widespread slavery, in a culture and place very different from ours, and many complex and problematic issues of power and class, comes this clear commandment that every single person, every sentient being was guaranteed the Sabbath. In other places in the Torah, these kinds of laws actually extend that practice of rest to farmland, to the earth itself. It had to be understood that the survival of people whose lives were intertwined together depended on the God-given right for everyone to rest, and the people would ignore it at their great peril. Imagine the breakdown of a society that doesn't recognize the most basic human rights: to rest, to just be. And so I've started thinking a lot lately about how that commandment to rest can't be separated from a right to rest, regardless of status, wealth, or power. What does this mean for people who have no place to rest? When my family first moved to Minneapolis, where I now, 11 years ago this very week, became the associate minister at Mayflower UCC, we looked for housing we could afford in that part of South Minneapolis, and the closest thing we found was 2 miles away in the central neighborhood, an apartment where we could start raising our little baby. And we were thrilled to see it was across from a small Carnegie library. And you can imagine that as we raised a toddler, we spent a lot of time at that library and walking around the block again and again and again. And I started to notice something unusual when we would walk past the sign at the back end of the library. In a space below the sign, Hennepin County libraries are like a big rectangle that's kind of low to the ground and about 12 inches up. And in that space down there, someone had neatly made their bed of thin blankets. Camouflaged among the bushes and hidden in the shadow of the library sign, a neighbor with no place else to undisturbed at night, probably hoping no one would ever notice that they were there. Perhaps this was a library patron who during the day benefited from the services of social workers employed by the libraries. But once that sign switches from open to closed, it's time to go outside. There are so many stories untold across the country, as according to HUD's annual survey, the number of people experiencing homelessness on one day last year increased 12% over the previous year. And 37% of the unhoused Americans counted that day were unsheltered. That means living outside, in a car, or some other place not meant for people to sleep. If you have noticed that number of unsheltered people experiencing homelessness going up and up and up, and the visibility of encampments in the United States, not only in Minnesota, you're right, it hasn't always been like this. This is unprecedented, and it's really alarming in a country of such wealth. I worked in the fields of shelter and housing for many years, but I never get over, and I pray that I never do, witnessing the impossible choices for an unhoused person and the risk they might take just to lie down at night like we all want to do. My heart cries out in lament and anger. Isn't there a law that guarantees my unhoused neighbor a right to rest in a safe place? Isn't there a North Star that guides us in deciding as a community that no one should have to live like this? These questions have become bold headlines since the Supreme Court decided in favor of the city of Grants Pass, Oregon, in June, in a case that homeless advocates have dreaded for a long time as they've traveled the country telling their stories and trying to organize for their own rights. And I am much less proud of my home state of Oregon for challenging this law. The city of Grants Pass passed an ordinance to punish people for sleeping in public. And because of precedent that had previously assured people the right to sleep on public land if there were no shelter available, it was challenged by Grants Pass and ended up in our highest court. In this small southern Oregon city with around 600 homeless residents, violators face steep fines, $295 the first time, which increases to $537.60 if it is not paid, and it's not going to be paid. When individuals receive 2 citations, police in Grants Pass can issue an order banning them from city property, and anyone who violates such an order can be convicted on criminal trespass charges, which carry penalties of up to 30 days in jail and a fine of $1,250. If someone could pay that fine, of course, they'd be paying rent or a mortgage. This case already has devastating impacts across the country, as well-organized proponents of these ordinances were ready to pass similar laws across the country as soon as that decision came down. And if we think it's just happening in more populated states with huge cities like California, or very conservative places, think again. Duluth, Brainerd, and Rochester have already passed these ordinances within 2 months of the Supreme Court ruling. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that it feels right now like there's a war on homeless people, a legal war in the United States right now. Our sister UCC churches in those communities spoke up boldly along with other advocates, but there's already so much power behind these bans that's been a shock to anyone who's actually working for solutions in their own communities. Justice Sonia Sotomayor spoke prophetically in her dissenting opinion, joined by Justices Kagan and Brehm Jackson. She argued that the majority's ruling focused almost exclusively on the needs of local government and leaves the most vulnerable in our society with an impossible choice. either stay awake or be arrested. This ruling basically criminalizes being homeless. I don't know anyone who feels encampments are the long-term solution to homelessness. Homes are the solution to homelessness. Homes and services and housing subsidies, along with all kinds of investments that would make our communities more equitable for all people. But it's becoming a shocking new normal to prosecute people who are living in extreme poverty in the United States. Camping bans are not only totally ineffective and counterproductive, they should offend our most deeply held values as a democracy. How does it make sense that a person without a place to live is forced to stay awake when it is our systems that have failed them and the powerful who have gone to sleep? People of the Jewish and Christian faiths have a North Star that should guide our response to the crisis of unsheltered homelessness in our communities. And our kin of other faiths and philosophies have similar guiding principles. It's all about responsibility to our neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. We need to reckon publicly, I would say, with these values where we are falling so short in this time. Have we thought about what it means to protect the holy, God-given right to rest? Not only for ourselves individually, but for all of us collectively. How differently would we approach the solutions if we centered the demands of unhoused people for more just treatment under the law, adequate investments in services and housing, and compassion for those who are struggling in this economy that's left them out for generations, often with racial bias, especially in our own state, Minnesota? I didn't come here with a ton of answers today. I have some, but not the whole answer. But I tell you, there will be work to do here in the Twin Cities. And I'd love to invite dialogue amongst UCC churches all over the state and others standing up to these unjust laws. I'm trusting that God has given us all we need if we but turn to one another with grace, humility, a willingness, and keep the right questions at the center of our politics. Maybe we don't know the answer today, but with God's grace, we will find it. May we have the spiritual strength as we seek to live these values out the best that we can in our own lives and work tirelessly until all are neighbors